It started as one of those peculiar habits you develop as a teenager when the world feels like it's both too small and too overwhelming all at once. Back then, I had this strange compulsion to face my fears, to challenge myself in ways that didn't make a whole lot of sense to anyone else. For me, that meant walking at night, alone, in complete darkness, often through forests or unlit trails where the silence was thick and the shadows stretched endlessly. I told myself it was about courage, about proving something to myself. But if I'm being honest, I think a part of me just liked the thrill, the way the air felt heavier at night, the way my own heartbeat filled my ears. One night in particular has stayed with me all these years. It's the reason I never went back to those walks, the reason the mere thought of being in the woods after dark sends a cold ripple down my spine. I still think about it sometimes, lying awake in bed, and I try to rationalize it, to make sense of what happened. But even now, the memory feels raw, like an open wound that never quite healed. It was late, probably past midnight. I remember the sky was overcast, which made the night even darker than usual. There wasn't a sliver of moonlight to guide me, just an oppressive blackness that swallowed everything. The forest I chose that night was one I'd walked through before during the day. It had a winding path that cut through dense trees, the kind that formed a canopy overhead, blocking out most of the light even during daylight hours. At night, it felt like stepping into another world entirely. I didn't have a flashlight. That was part of the challenge, part of the thrill. My eyes would adjust after a while, and I'd rely on the faint outlines of trees or the feel of the dirt path beneath my feet to navigate. It was terrifying at first, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sending jolts of adrenaline through me. But then, as always, I'd settle into the rhythm of it, my fear giving way to a strange sense of peace. There's something about being alone in the dark that strips away all pretense, leaving just you and the rawness of the moment. That night, though, the peace never came. From the moment I stepped onto the path, there was an uneasiness in the air, a tension I couldn't shake. The forest felt different, heavier, quieter. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal life, the chirping of crickets or the occasional hoot of an owl, seemed muted. My footsteps sounded too loud, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my sneakers echoing in the silence. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd been spooked by the lack of light or the oppressive stillness. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if the darkness itself was pressing in on me, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I kept going, though, stubbornly refusing to turn back. I'd done this before. I'd faced the fear, and I'd always come out the other side feeling exhilarated. Then I saw him. It happened so fast, I didn't even have time to process it. 1 second, I was alone, my eyes straining to make out the faint outlines of the path ahead. The next, there was a figure, solid, unmoving, and so close I could have reached out and touched him. I didn't hear him approach, didn't see any hint of movement or light. He was just there, as if he'd materialized out of the darkness itself. For a split second, we just stood there, staring at each other. Or at least I think he was staring. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the rough outline of his body. He was taller than me, broad-shouldered, wearing something dark that blended into the shadows. My brain struggled to make sense of it, to register what I was seeing. And then the fear hit me like a tidal wave. I screamed. I don't even remember deciding to do it. It just came out raw and primal, a sound I didn't know I was capable of making. Before I even finished screaming, I was running. My legs moved on instinct, propelling me forward down the path, away from him, away from the suffocating blackness where he'd appeared. The sound of my own breathing was deafening, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then I heard it, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, pounding against the dirt in a rhythm that matched my own. He was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing him, of confirming that he was right there, was more than I could handle. So I just ran, my feet barely touching the ground, my body screaming in protest as I pushed it harder and harder. The path twisted and turned, and I stumbled more than once, my hands scraping against rough bark or jagged stones as I fought to stay upright. The footsteps stayed close at first, the sound of them sending spikes of terror through me with every beat. But gradually, they began to fade. I don't know if he was slowing down or if I was somehow outrunning him, but the distance between us grew. Still, I didn't stop. I couldn't. The fear had taken over completely, driving me forward like a wild animal fleeing a predator. When I finally burst out of the forest, my lungs felt like they were on fire. my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, my whole body shaking. For a long time, I just lay there, staring up at the dark sky, trying to process what had happened. I never saw him again. I don't know who he was or why he was there. Maybe he was a forest ranger, as I later tried to convince myself, someone doing his job who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe he was something else entirely, something darker. Back then, I was sure he was a killer, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone foolish enough to wander into his territory. I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that I never went back to the forest at night. The thrill, the challenge, the sense of facing my fears, it all seemed meaningless after that. I'd faced something that night, something real and raw and terrifying, and it left a scar I carry to this day. Even now, years later, the memory feels as vivid as if it happened yesterday. The sound of those footsteps, the oppressive darkness, the sheer, unrelenting terror, I don't think I'll ever forget it. And maybe that's for the best. Some lessons, after all, are meant to stick with you. Growing up in the 80s, life felt simpler in some ways. As a kid, maybe 11 or 12, I had what felt like the entire world at my fingertips. My best friend Alex, and I lived in a neighborhood that backed right into miles upon miles of untamed woods. These woods were our playground, our battlefield, our home away from home. We'd wake up early during summer break, pack sandwiches, grab sodas, and head off to lose ourselves in that endless sea of trees. There were no limits, no real boundaries. The woods felt infinite. We'd play for hours, games like war or cowboys and Indians, turning fallen logs into forts or pretending sticks were swords. It was the kind of freedom kids today might never understand. No phones, no internet, just the crunch of leaves underfoot and the sound of our laughter echoing through the trees. Our parents didn't worry much about us being out there. We were smart enough to stay out of real trouble, and my dad, in particular, encouraged our little adventures. He even liked taking us to the Army surplus store to pick up gear, survival knives, MREs, camping equipment. We'd sometimes camp out near the edge of the woods, with him helping us set up, and those nights felt like magic. But one day, we found something that shattered that magic forever. It started like any other summer day. Alex and I packed up early, peanut butter sandwiches, a couple of cans of Coke, and our trusty knives strapped to our hips. We'd been pushing further into the woods each time we went out, determined to explore every inch of it. This time, we stumbled upon something new, something we'd never seen before despite all our wandering. A treehouse. It was perched high in the branches, maybe 30 feet off the ground. From below, it looked solid, well built, with a little deck that wrapped around one side and a small door leading inside. To two kids like us, it was a castle, a treasure, a kingdom waiting to be claimed. We couldn't believe our luck. We spent what felt like hours just standing there, staring up at it, imagining all the adventures we could have if we made it ours. Excited, we raced home to tell my dad. He seemed amused by our excitement, and even offered to take us to the surplus store to buy some rope. Over dinner, Alex and I couldn't stop talking about it, planning how we'd climb up, what we'd do once we got inside. It felt like the start of something incredible. The next morning, we were up before dawn. With a backpack full of rope, sandwiches, and a couple of other supplies, we set off for the treehouse. It was a long hike, maybe 2 or 3 miles over rocky, uneven terrain, but we didn't care. The whole way there, we were buzzing with excitement, talking about what we'd find inside, maybe old toys, comic books, who knew. When we finally got there, we got to work right away. Using some thick branches we found nearby, we started making a rope ladder, tying the sticks securely to the rope. It was slow, tiring work, but we didn't mind. By mid-afternoon, we had it finished and threw the ladder over a sturdy branch near the treehouse deck. Climbing up was scary at first. 30 feet feels a lot higher when you're dangling from a homemade ladder, but eventually we made it. The view from the deck was incredible. We could see the tops of the trees stretching out in every direction, a green ocean with no end in sight. For a moment, it felt like all our dreams had come true. We played rock, paper, scissors to decide who would go inside first. Alex won, but when he opened the door and stepped in, everything changed. Alex came back out almost immediately. His face was pale, his eyes wide, his hands shaking. He didn't say much, just muttered something about wanting to go home. I was confused. This was what we'd been waiting for, what we'd worked so hard for. I couldn't just leave without seeing it for myself. So I stepped inside. The air inside the treehouse felt different. Stale, heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls were covered, every single inch of them, with photographs. At first, I thought they were just pictures of people, maybe a family or something. But as I got closer, my stomach turned. They weren't ordinary photos. They were Polaroids and glossy magazine pages, all of children, all naked. Some of the kids looked about my age, maybe younger. The images were pinned up neatly, side by side, covering the walls completely. I felt sick. My chest tightened, my head spun, and for a moment, I thought I might throw up. I backed out of the treehouse as fast as I could, nearly slipping on the deck. We didn't say much on the way home. What could we say? We just walked, our usual chatter replaced by an oppressive silence. When we got back, we told my dad what we'd found. His face went dark as we described it. Without a word, he picked up the phone and called the police. A cop came by later that evening. He asked us questions, where the treehouse was, how we got up there, what we saw. But as the conversation went on, his tone shifted. He started asking odd questions, like where we'd bought the rope or if we'd taken any of the pictures off the walls. His attitude became almost accusatory, like we'd done something wrong by finding it. My dad eventually cut him off, telling him we'd given our statement, and that was enough. The cop left, promising to follow up, but we never heard anything more about it. After that, our freedom in the woods was gone. My parents wouldn't let us go out for more than an hour at a time, and even then, we had to stay close to home. We tried to make the best of it, building a long tin-can phone system to communicate from different parts of the yard. But it wasn't the same. The woods didn't feel like ours anymore. They felt tainted. Years later, when I was in college, Alex emailed me out of the blue. He'd read something in the state paper, a short article about that cop, the one who'd questioned us about the treehouse. Apparently, he'd shot himself with his service weapon after his wife discovered that he'd been circulating child pornography. The realization hit us both like a freight train. That treehouse, it had been his. His stash, his hidden cave. We'd stumbled onto something we were never supposed to find, and he'd known it. That's why he'd acted so strangely, why he'd tried to deflect and downplay what we'd told him. But the creepiest part came a few months later, when Alex sent me another email. He'd gone to an estate auction, curious about what might turn up. Among the items for sale was a rope ladder, bundled neatly in a bag. It was the same ladder we'd made that day, years ago, to climb into that treehouse. The thought of it still makes my skin crawl. To this day, I can't think about those woods, or that treehouse, without feeling a deep, gnawing unease. What we found there, what it meant, it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. It was a summer when life felt full of possibilities, and the world seemed bigger than it ever would again. I was in my late teens, visiting a friend's grandparents' place for a long weekend. Their property wasn't exactly in the middle of nowhere, but it was isolated enough to feel like we'd left the real world behind. The kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the hum of the city was replaced by the whisper of the wind through trees and the gentle trickle of a nearby creek. The house was modest but comfortable, perched on a slight hill overlooking a stretch of woods and fields. A small creek wound its way through the land, marking the boundary between the grandparents' property and their neighbors. The water was shallow, clear, and teeming with life, a perfect spot for two bored teenagers to waste an afternoon. It was my friend's idea to go frog catching. He was more familiar with the area, having spent countless summers there as a kid, and he promised it would be fun. I was indifferent at first, but agreed to tag along. It wasn't like there was much else to do out there. Armed with a creel and some old nets, we set out in the late morning, the sun already climbing high and casting long shadows over the water. The creek was alive with movement, frogs darting from rock to rock or disappearing into the reeds with a splash. It didn't take long before we had a half dozen in the creel, their slimy bodies squirming against one another. The day was shaping up to be unremarkable, just another lazy afternoon in the countryside. But then my friend spotted something. At the base of a tree on the neighbor's side of the creek, there was a strange pile of sticks and leaves. It wasn't natural. You could tell right away that someone had arranged it, as if they were trying to hide something. The sticks were stacked in a way that seemed deliberate, the leaves carefully spread over them like a makeshift cover. My friend pointed it out, his voice tinged with curiosity. We debated for a moment about whether to check it out. It was technically on the neighbor's property, but there wasn't a fence or anything to mark the boundary. In the end, curiosity won out. We crossed the creek, the cool water soaking into our shoes, and made our way to the tree. The pile wasn't large, just enough to make you pause and wonder what might be underneath. Carefully, we began to pull it apart, brushing aside the leaves and setting the sticks to one side. Beneath them, buried in the dirt, was a plastic freezer bag. It looked dirty and worn, like it had been there for a while. I remember thinking it might be trash, someone's discarded lunch or a bag of old papers. But when we picked it up, the contents became clear. Inside the bag were photographs, magazines, and what looked like Polaroids. At first, we didn't understand what we were looking at. I remember opening the bag, my friend leaning over my shoulder as we flipped through the contents. But then it hit us, like a punch to the gut. The pictures weren't just inappropriate, they were horrifying. Explicit images of children, some younger than we could comprehend, in situations so vile that I can barely bring myself to think about them now. My stomach turned, and my hands started to shake. I shoved the bag back into the pile, covering it up as quickly as I could. My friend was pale, his expression blank, as if his brain couldn't fully process what we'd just seen. Without a word, we turned and made our way back to the house, our earlier excitement replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. When we got back, we told his grandfather what we'd found. The old man listened quietly, his face unreadable. He didn't ask too many questions, just said he'd handle it and notify the police. We trusted him, assuming he'd do the right thing. We expected to hear from the cops, maybe get called in to explain what we'd seen or show them where to find it. But days passed and nothing happened. Eventually, the incident faded into the background, buried under the weight of everyday life. We didn't talk about it again. Years went by. Life moved on, as it always does. I graduated, got a job, and drifted apart from that friend. The memory of the bag stayed with me, though, lurking in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't something I dwelled on, but every now and then it would surface, bringing with it the same sick feeling I'd had that day by the creek. Then, about a decade later, I heard that the grandfather had passed away. I didn't think much of it at first. He'd been old when I'd met him, and his death seemed like the natural progression of time. But shortly after, news started to trickle out. Stories from his daughters and granddaughters, tales of years of abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual. It was like a dam had broken, and all these horrors that had been hidden for so long came flooding to the surface. The realization hit me like a freight train. That bag, that sickening stash of images, it had to have been his. It made sense now, the way he'd reacted so calmly when we told him about it, the way nothing had ever come of it. He hadn't reported it to the police because he couldn't. It was his secret, his disgusting collection, buried out in the woods where he thought no one would ever find it. I felt sick all over again, the same way I had that day by the creek. But this time, there was something else too: anger, disgust, a burning sense of betrayal. The thought that this man, someone who'd seemed so normal, so harmless, could hide something so vile right under everyone's noses was almost too much to bear. The final twist came a few months later. My friend, who I hadn't spoken to in years, reached out to me. He'd gone to the estate sale, curious about what might be up for auction. Among the items was a freezer bag, its contents removed but the bag itself unmistakable. Seeing it again brought everything rushing back: the creek, the pile of sticks, the horrible images inside. It's been years since all this happened, but I still think about it sometimes. About how close we came to leaving that pile undisturbed, to never uncovering the truth. About how people can hide the darkest parts of themselves in plain sight. The woods that once felt like a place of freedom and adventure now haunt my memories. I can't set foot in a forest without feeling the weight of that discovery, without wondering what other secrets might be buried in the shadows. It was one of those road trips that felt like a great idea at the time, a spontaneous escape from routine, just me and my friend, heading into the unknown with nothing but a rough idea of where we wanted to end up. We'd planned to find a quiet spot to camp, relax, and enjoy the kind of stillness you can only find in the middle of nowhere. Little did we know that stillness would turn into something entirely different, something oppressive, nerve-wracking, and impossible to shake even years later. We'd been driving for about an hour, winding down old country roads with no houses, no gas stations, and not even a single car passing by. It was just endless pastures and dirt roads stretching out into the horizon. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, painting the landscape in shades of gold and deepening shadows. The isolation felt peaceful at first, a welcome change from the noise of city life. But as the minutes ticked by and the roads grew narrower, a small knot of unease started to form in my stomach. Still, I brushed it off. When we came to a national park sign after crossing a cattle guard, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Sweet, I thought. A national park, free to enter and usually well-maintained. It couldn't be too bad, right? My friend glanced over at me, her face betraying a little hesitation, but we were both tired and hungry. The thought of stopping and setting up camp sounded too tempting to resist. So I turned left and started up the road that the map said would lead to the campsite, about 2 miles up the hill. At first, the road seemed manageable, narrow but still passable. The dirt and gravel crunched under the tires of my Chevy Cruze, a car that in hindsight was laughably ill-suited for this kind of terrain. But as we climbed higher, the road began to change. It became rougher, more uneven, with large rocks scattered across the path and deep ruts carved into the earth. The brush on either side of us grew thicker and more tangled, encroaching on the road like it was trying to swallow us whole. About a quarter mile in, I felt the car lurch and scrape against something solid, a rock too large to clear with my car's low clearance. The sound of the undercarriage grinding against the stone made my stomach drop. I glanced at my friend, who was gripping the door handle tightly, her knuckles white. Okay, I thought. As long as it doesn't get any worse, we can manage this. But there was no turning around. The road was too narrow, and the idea of reversing down the rocky, uneven path was even more terrifying than continuing forward. So with no other choice, I gritted my teeth and pressed on. The road did get worse. Much worse. Every few feet, the car would scrape or stall, the sound echoing in the silence like a warning we were too stubborn or too scared to heed. The brush on either side of us had gone from green to brown to a sickly, lifeless gray, the kind of dead vegetation that seemed to suck the color out of the world around it. The sun had almost disappeared by this point, leaving us with only the dim glow of twilight and the car's headlights to light the way. Every turn felt like it could be the last straw for the car. The rocks seemed to grow larger, the ruts deeper, and the path more treacherous with each passing minute. My hands were clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that they ached, and I could feel the tension radiating from my friend as she braced herself against the door. The air inside the car felt stifling, thick with a mix of fear and frustration. After what felt like an eternity, 30 minutes that might as well have been 30 hours, we finally reached the top of the hill. According to the map, this was supposed to be the campsite, but calling it that was generous to the point of absurdity. It was nothing more than a small, uneven clearing, barely large enough to park the car, surrounded by the same lifeless brush that had lined the road. And directly ahead of us was a sheer cliff, dropping off into darkness. The place felt wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. The silence was oppressive, not the peaceful kind you'd expect in the wilderness, but the kind that made your skin crawl. The dead brush seemed to press in on us, and the cliff ahead felt like a warning. I killed the engine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The stillness was suffocating, the kind that made every small sound, a rustle of leaves, the creak of the car as we shifted in our seats, feel amplified. We didn't even discuss staying. The thought of stepping out of the car into that eerie clearing, setting up camp under the shadow of that cliff, was unthinkable. My friend and I exchanged a glance, and that was all it took. We were getting out of there. Turning the car around was its own nightmare. The clearing was so small that it took a series of careful, nerve-wracking maneuvers to avoid either backing into the brush or driving off the cliff. Every time the car lurched over a rock or scraped against the uneven ground, I felt a fresh wave of panic. It was like the hill itself didn't want us to leave, like it was trying to trap us there. When we finally got the car pointed back down the hill, the real terror began. The path that had been difficult to climb was even worse to descend. The headlights illuminated the rocks and ruts ahead, casting long, distorted shadows that made it hard to tell where the road ended and the brush began. Every scrape of the undercarriage felt like a knife to my nerves, and every bump made me fear the car would break down completely. At one point, the car tilted so sharply to one side that I thought we might tip over. My friend let out a sharp gasp, and I had to fight the urge to slam on the brakes, knowing it would only make things worse. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, we made our way down, the tension in the car so thick it was almost suffocating. When we finally reached the bottom of the hill and crossed the cattle guard back onto the main road, the relief was almost overwhelming. The dirt road felt like a smooth highway compared to what we'd just endured, and the sight of open pastures instead of dead brush felt like a gift. But the fear didn't entirely fade. The memory of that hill, that clearing, stayed with us as we drove away, our eyes scanning the rearview mirror as if expecting something to follow. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, 2 hours away. By the time we pulled into the Walmart parking lot, it was well past midnight, and we were too exhausted to do anything but recline our seats and try to sleep. The parking lot lights felt like a blessing, a small reminder that we were back in the real world, far from the isolation and unease of that hill. Even now, I can't fully explain what it was about that place that felt so wrong. There were no ghostly apparitions, no mysterious figures lurking in the shadows, just a sense of dread that seemed to seep into the air itself. Maybe it was the dead brush, the isolation, or the sheer difficulty of the road that made it feel like we didn't belong there. Or maybe it was something deeper, something I'll never be able to understand. All I know is that I've never been back, and I never will. Some places are better left unexplored. Exploring caves had always been a fascination of mine. There's something about the isolation, the quiet, and the idea of venturing into places untouched by most people that makes it addictive. A few years back, my friend Mike and I decided to explore a nearby limestone cave system. I'd been there a few times before, but I'd never gone too deep. I'd read online about a waterfall inside the cave that supposedly led to a massive open area beyond it. That was our goal, to find the waterfall and the hidden expanse that lay beyond. It was early spring, and the weather was cool but not cold, perfect for caving. We packed lightly, bringing headlamps, spare batteries, some snacks, a rope, and a few other essentials. We weren't professional spelunkers by any means, but we were cautious. Mike and I had a good system. One of us would scout ahead while the other stayed behind to serve as a backup, just in case we reached a point where one of us needed help or couldn't continue. It was all about avoiding situations we couldn't get out of. The first part of the cave was familiar. The entrance was wide and inviting, with sunlight spilling into the first few meters. The air inside was damp and cool, carrying that unmistakable earthy smell of limestone and wet rock. Our headlamps cut through the dim light, illuminating the path ahead as we made our way deeper. The familiar sections were easy to navigate, with wide passages and clear footing. It felt like a warm-up, the calm before the real adventure. After an hour or so, we reached the end of the route I knew. This was where the real exploration began. Ahead of us was a narrow climb down, the kind of squeeze that made me question whether this was such a good idea. It was a tight vertical descent, like trying to climb from the front seat to the back seat of a compact car, except turned upright. I went first, sliding down carefully, making sure my footing was solid. The rock was damp but not slippery, which was a small mercy. Once I was down, I called up to Mike, who followed without any issues. The next section was a horizontal tunnel, wide enough to be comfortable, but so low that we had to crawl on all fours. We took off our backpacks and dragged them behind us as we crawled. It wasn't too bad at first, but after 10 or 15 meters, the confined space started to get to me. There's something about being on your hands and knees in a dark, enclosed space that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. I focused on the sound of my gloves scraping against the rock and the soft thud of my backpack dragging behind me to keep my nerves in check. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, about the size of a half-bathroom. It was just big enough for us to stand up and stretch, which was a relief. The ceiling sloped slightly, and the walls were smooth and glistening with moisture. We took a moment to catch our breath and drink some water before continuing. The next path forward was a low, square tunnel about 2 meters wide. We jokingly named it the coffin crawl because of its shape, but the humor quickly faded as we realized just how long we'd have to crawl through it. The coffin crawl was tight, but manageable at first. I led the way, with Mike following close behind. The walls felt like they were pressing in on us, and the ceiling was so low that I had to keep my head tilted down. As we moved, the tunnel began to curve slightly, and the space narrowed even more. At one point, I glanced back at Mike, and I could see the unease in his eyes. Neither of us said anything, but I knew we were both starting to question whether this was a good idea. The crawl seemed to go on forever. My knees and elbows were starting to ache from the rough rock, and the air felt heavier, as if the cave itself was trying to squeeze the breath out of me. I couldn't tell how far we'd gone, but it felt like miles. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw a faint opening ahead. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a cramped coat closet, but it was a welcome sight. At least there, we could sit up and turn around if we needed to. Reaching that opening wasn't easy. The tunnel narrowed to the tightest squeeze I'd ever experienced. I had to stretch one arm forward while keeping the other by my side to fit my shoulders through diagonally. The rock pressed against my chest and back, making it hard to breathe. My headlamp illuminated the small space ahead, and I could see a single stalagmite rising from the floor like a miniature pillar. It wasn't much, but it felt like a beacon, a sign that we were almost there. As I inched closer, I noticed movement in the space ahead. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I realized what it was: bats. Small, mouse-eared bats clung to the walls and ceiling of the chamber, their bodies huddled together in clusters. I didn't think much of it. Bats were common in caves, but when Mike's voice echoed behind me, it startled them. The bats erupted into motion, their wings flapping wildly as they swarmed toward the tunnel. In the confined space, there was nowhere to go. I pressed myself against the floor as the bats flew over me, their wings brushing against my face and arms. The sound of their fluttering filled the tunnel, drowning out everything else. My heart was racing, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. It took every ounce of mental control to stay calm and keep moving forward. When the bats finally cleared, I dragged myself into the small chamber and sat up, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Mike crawled in behind me, his face pale and his eyes wide. We didn't say anything, but the look we shared said it all. That had been too close for comfort. The chamber was small and cramped, with sloped walls and a low ceiling. The single stalagmite stood in the center like a silent sentinel. As I scanned the space with my headlamp, something caught my eye: a small piece of paper pinned to the stalagmite with a rock. It was the torn corner of a notebook page, and written on it in blue ink were two words: "Nothing here." I stared at the note, trying to process what it meant. Had someone else come looking for the same path we were trying to find? Had they reached this point and given up? The words felt like a message, a warning, and a mockery all at once. After everything we'd gone through, there was nothing here. No waterfall, no expansive area, just a dead end in the middle of nowhere. We sat there for a while, letting the weight of the journey sink in. The air was heavy and stale, and the silence was absolute. Eventually, we decided it was time to turn back. The thought of crawling through the coffin crawl again, of squeezing through that impossibly tight passage, was daunting, but we didn't have a choice. There was no other way out. The journey back was even more exhausting than the way in. Every scrape of rock against my knees, every tight squeeze, felt like it was sapping the last bit of energy I had. By the time we emerged from the cave into the cool evening air, I was drenched in sweat and covered in dust. The sight of the open sky and the sound of the wind through the trees were the most welcome sensations I'd ever experienced. We never went back to that cave. The memory of those tight spaces, the bats, and that eerie little note was enough to keep me away. I still think about it sometimes, though. I wonder who left that note and what they were looking for. And I wonder if, somewhere deeper in the cave, there's more to find, or if it really is just nothing. Driving bread routes in the middle of the night was a job I'd taken mostly for the solitude. The quiet roads and early morning drives had a kind of eerie peace that I'd grown to enjoy over time. I started my shifts at 3 a.m., well before most people even thought about getting out of bed, and my route often took me through remote stretches of countryside. It was mostly uneventful work, loading up the truck, making the rounds to small stores in tiny towns, and heading home by mid-morning. This one particular night, though, didn't stay uneventful. I was about halfway through a 50-mile stretch between towns. It was pitch black outside, the kind of darkness where even the moon seemed to disappear behind a thick layer of clouds. The road stretched out endlessly ahead of me, flanked on both sides by nothing but fields. No houses, no streetlights, no sign of life for miles. The only sound was the hum of my truck engine and the occasional bump of tires over uneven asphalt. The monotony of the drive made it easy for my mind to wander. I'd been doing this job for a while, and I'd learned to let my thoughts drift to pass the time. But that night, something up ahead pulled me out of my daydreaming. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, barely visible in the glow of my headlights. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was big and bulky, parked right on the side of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a backhoe. That alone was odd. You don't expect to see construction equipment sitting on a deserted road at 3 in the morning. But then I noticed something even stranger. The bucket of the backhoe was raised high in the air, and dangling from it was the unmistakable silhouette of a cow. For a second, I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I got closer, the details became clearer. The cow wasn't just hanging there, it was being gutted. There was a man standing by the backhoe, covered in blood, his arms deep inside the cow's open carcass. Now, I grew up around ranching. I'd seen animals being butchered before, and I wasn't particularly squeamish about it. But there was something about this scene that didn't sit right with me. For one, this was happening on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, with no ranch or farm in sight. And second, the whole setup, the backhoe, the timing, the location, was just wrong. Despite the alarm bells ringing in the back of my mind, I did something I still can't fully explain. I slowed down. Maybe it was the ranching background in me, or maybe it was just sheer curiosity, but I wanted to know what the hell this guy was doing. My headlights lit up the scene as I pulled up alongside him and rolled down my window. The man turned to face me, and for the first time, I got a good look at him. He was middle-aged, with a weathered face and a wiry build. His clothes were soaked with blood, and his hands glistened in the beam of my lights. He was holding a knife, but his grip was casual, almost careless. When he saw me, he grinned, a wide, toothy smile that stretched across his face. "Need a hand?" I asked, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. That's when he started laughing. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was loud and hysterical, the kind of laugh that comes from deep in the gut. He slapped his knee and doubled over, shaking with amusement. For reasons I can't explain, I found myself laughing too. It wasn't funny, not even close, but the absurdity of the situation must have short-circuited something in my brain. So there we were, two guys in the middle of nowhere, one covered in blood, the other driving a truck full of bread, both laughing like lunatics. As the laughter echoed into the night, the reality of the situation started to hit me. This guy wasn't just butchering a cow. He'd driven a backhoe out here in the dead of night to kill and gut an animal that clearly wasn't his. He was poaching, plain and simple. And judging by the way he was acting, he didn't seem too concerned about being caught. That's when the fear started creeping in. I suddenly realized how alone I was out there. If this guy decided to turn that knife on me, there'd be no one around to stop him. No one would even know I was gone until hours later, when I didn't show up for my deliveries. The thought sent a chill down my spine, and my laughter died in my throat. The man was still grinning, his laughter subsiding into a series of wheezing chuckles. He gave me a casual wave, like we were old friends parting ways. I forced a weak smile and nodded, then hit the gas. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The backhoe and the man were quickly swallowed by the darkness, but I couldn't shake the image of that bloody grin. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, and my mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. The more I thought about it, the creepier it got. This guy had gone to a lot of trouble to poach a cow in the middle of nowhere. He'd driven a slow, noisy piece of machinery miles from anywhere, risking getting caught, just to butcher an animal on the side of the road. Who does that? And why? I spent the rest of the drive looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the backhoe creeping up behind me like something out of a horror movie. By the time I reached the next town, my nerves were shot. I parked behind the store, unloaded the bread, and sat in the truck for a long time, just trying to calm down. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to make sense of it. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. That man wasn't just poaching. He'd been enjoying himself, reveling in the absurdity of the situation. And for a brief moment, I'd been a part of it, laughing right along with him. I don't run bread routes anymore. I've moved on to a different job, one that doesn't require me to drive through the middle of nowhere in the dead of night. But every now and then, when I'm out on a quiet road, I think about that man and his backhoe. And I wonder how many other strange things happen out there in the darkness, far from the eyes of the world. Hiking has always been my go-to escape. There's something calming about being deep in the woods, far away from people and the noise of everyday life. I don't go unprepared. I pack my essentials, bring a map if the area is unfamiliar, and make sure to stick to the trails. I've had my share of odd encounters in nature, but nothing that prepared me for what I found on that hike. It was late spring, and the days were getting longer, but I knew better than to lose track of time. I'd set out early that afternoon to explore a trail I hadn't been on before. It was supposed to be an easy loop, a couple of miles at most, winding through dense forest and looping back to the parking area. The hike started like any other. The trail was well marked, with a soft layer of pine needles underfoot. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels. I kept a steady pace, stopping now and then to take a picture or admire the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. By the time I reached the farthest point on the loop, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. The golden light gave the woods an almost magical quality, but I knew I needed to head back soon. It's one thing to enjoy the solitude of the forest. It's another to be caught out there in the dark. I turned around and started making my way back toward the parking area. The trail seemed quieter now. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the rustling in the underbrush had ceased. I chalked it up to the time of day, animals settling in for the night. Still, the silence felt heavier than it should have, like the woods were holding their breath. As I rounded a bend, something off to the side of the trail caught my eye. It was hanging from a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze. At first, I thought it was trash, maybe an old piece of fabric or a plastic bag. But as I got closer, I realized it was a baby doll head. It was small, about the size of my palm, with pale plastic skin and painted blue eyes that stared blankly ahead. Dirt smudged its face, and the remnants of its neck were jagged, as if it had been torn from its body. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped off the trail for a closer look. As I approached, I noticed another doll head hanging a few feet away. Then another, and another. I stopped and looked up. My stomach turned. There were hundreds of them, hanging from the branches of the trees. They varied in size and condition. Some were tiny, like the kind that might belong to a child's tea set. Others were larger, their vacant eyes framed by patches of synthetic hair. Most looked old, their faces weathered and stained, but here and there were newer ones, their plastic skins still shiny and clean. They dangled from strings, wire, and even chains, swaying gently in the breeze like some grotesque wind chime. I stood frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Who would do something like this? And why? There was no rhyme or reason to the arrangement. The heads were spaced randomly, some close together, others far apart. The sheer number of them was overwhelming. The air felt colder now, and the silence of the forest pressed in around me. I suddenly became acutely aware of how alone I was out here. The trail was a good 50 feet behind me, hidden by the thick undergrowth. My heart started to pound, and an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were rapid, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't the erratic scampering of a deer or the deliberate crunch of a bear. These were human footsteps, quick and purposeful, heading straight toward me. Panic set in. I turned and bolted back toward the trail, my boots slipping on the loose pine needles. Branches whipped at my arms and face, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. When I reached the trail, I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The footsteps were behind me now, closer than I would have liked, but I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that tree as possible. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, the twists and turns unfamiliar in my panic. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of the parking area through the trees. When I finally burst out of the woods, I slowed to a walk, trying to catch my breath. My truck was the only vehicle in the lot, just as I'd left it. I glanced back at the trailhead, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees, but there was nothing. Just the empty forest, dark and silent. I climbed into my truck and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and pulled out of the lot. The headlights illuminated the trailhead for a brief moment before I turned onto the main road and drove away. The drive home felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream. The image of those doll heads haunted me, their blank eyes staring out from the branches. And the footsteps, whoever or whatever, had been chasing me, left an even deeper unease. To this day, I don't know what I stumbled across in that forest. Maybe it was some bizarre art installation, or a shrine to something I don't want to understand. Or maybe it was something worse, something I was never meant to see. I haven't been back to that trail since. I've told myself it's because there are plenty of other places to hike, but the truth is, I can't shake the feeling that if I went back, I might not make it out again. It was a typical night. I had worked late at the office, and my shift had finished around midnight. It was one of those quiet, peaceful nights that followed a busy day. No traffic, no people, just the hum of my car engine as I drove through the darkened streets. I decided to take the back roads home. There was something comforting about those roads. They were quiet, familiar, and stretched out long enough that I could drive without thinking too much. The roads weren't busy, not even at the best of times, but tonight, the emptiness felt more profound. The streetlights faded away the farther I drove, and soon I was surrounded by nothing but open fields and dark stretches of trees. My headlights illuminated the road ahead of me, but that was it. I had the entire night to myself, and it felt oddly peaceful. The further I went, the fewer houses there were. I was getting closer to the rural part of the town, where farms and small country roads replaced the concrete and pavement. I liked this part of the drive. It was quiet, and I didn't have to worry about anyone being in a rush. It was just me and the road. I passed the familiar old barn and waved to the gas station that I always thought of as the halfway point. Then I made the turn onto a smaller road that led into even more desolate areas. This road wasn't paved. It was mostly dirt and gravel, and the occasional pothole made me slow down to avoid damaging my tires. I didn't mind. The silence of the night was peaceful. But then something caught my eye. Up ahead, I saw a strange shape on the side of the road. It didn't seem like it belonged. As I got closer, I made out the shape of an old, beat-up truck parked there, just sitting by itself. There were no lights on, no signs of anyone around. It was odd to see a truck this far out. The only people who lived in this area were farmers or ranchers, and they usually stayed close to their land. I slowed down, unsure of what I was seeing. The truck was positioned awkwardly, facing off to the side of the road. Its rusty exterior looked weathered by years of neglect. The tires were old and bald, but the strangest thing about the truck was the way it was parked. It wasn't abandoned, at least not in the way you'd expect. It looked like someone had left it there, but for what reason? It wasn't the kind of place you'd park unless you were in a real hurry. As I drove closer, I noticed something else. The bucket of the backhoe that was attached to the truck was unusually high. It was raised up in the air, as if something was hanging from it. I couldn't see what it was yet, but the shape of it made my stomach tighten. My brain was trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it just wasn't adding up. I was almost next to the truck now, and that's when I saw it. The thing hanging from the backhoe's bucket was a cow. The sight of it made my heart skip a beat. The cow was suspended by its hooves, dangling from the bucket, and its body was partially torn open. The image was jarring. There was blood everywhere, streaking down the animal's body, dripping onto the ground. The darkness of the night seemed to amplify the horror of the scene. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I grew up around ranching and had seen animals butchered before, but this was different. This was something out of place, something that didn't feel right. A cow shouldn't be hanging from a backhoe on the side of the road like that, not in the middle of nowhere, with no one around. I considered driving past quickly, pretending I didn't see anything, but something in me pushed me to slow down. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the fact that I felt a strange compulsion to understand what was happening. I couldn't explain why I felt the need to stop, but I did. So, I eased my car to a halt just a few feet away from the truck. The headlights from my car illuminated the scene even more clearly, and I could see the blood glistening in the light. The cow's body was limp, its eyes wide open and unblinking. It was a disturbing sight, and I immediately regretted my decision to stop. I rolled down my window and looked around. The area was completely still. No other cars were passing by, and there were no other lights in sight. It felt as though I had stumbled upon something forbidden, something that was never meant to be seen. I hesitated for a moment before calling out, "Need a hand?" I said, my voice uncertain. Almost immediately, the man standing near the backhoe turned and looked at me. I hadn't noticed him before, but he was there now, standing in the shadows, covered in blood from head to toe. He didn't seem startled at all. Instead, he smiled at me, a wide, almost unsettling grin. Then, without saying a word, he waved. Something about that wave sent a chill down my spine. It was too casual, too familiar for the situation. I had no idea who this guy was or why he was out here, but he wasn't acting like someone in distress or someone needing help. He looked calm, even amused, as if everything about the situation was perfectly normal. I felt an uncomfortable knot form in my stomach. I didn't know what I was dealing with here, but I suddenly felt very aware of how isolated I was. I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was no one else around for miles. I smiled weakly and waved back, trying to keep my composure. But my brain was starting to spiral. Why would someone be out here in the middle of nowhere, working on a dead cow at this hour? Why was he alone? And why was he so calm? Before I could stop myself, I found myself laughing. It wasn't intentional, but it came out as a nervous chuckle. The whole situation felt so absurd, so surreal, that I couldn't help it. I was laughing at the absurdity of it all, the strange sense of discomfort mixing with confusion. To my surprise, the man started laughing too. It wasn't a casual chuckle, though. It was a loud, manic, almost hysterical laugh. The kind of laugh you hear when someone has lost their grip on reality. It was unsettling, the way it echoed into the night, bouncing off the empty fields. I couldn't help it. I joined in, laughing with him. It felt like I was caught in some bizarre moment, something so odd that the only thing left to do was laugh. It wasn't even funny. It was terrifying, but somehow the laughter took over. We both laughed, the two of us, alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the dark fields and the strange scene with the cow. It went on for a moment, maybe longer than it should have, but eventually I stopped. Reality began to hit me. My laugh faded, and my mind cleared. I looked at the man again. His smile was still wide, but there was something unsettling about it. He wasn't normal. He wasn't someone who should be out here in the middle of the night, covered in blood, acting like everything was fine. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat quickening. I needed to get out of there. Something was off. Everything about this situation was wrong. Without another word, I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal and drove off. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel his eyes on me, burning into the back of my head as I sped away. As I drove back down the road, my hands gripping the wheel, I tried to make sense of what I had just experienced. Why had I stopped? What had possessed me to ask him if he needed help? What was going on with that truck, the cow, and the strange man in the middle of nowhere? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't want to know. I didn't want to understand. A few miles later, I came across a small diner. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me to stop and clear my head. I pulled into the parking lot, parked, and sat there for a moment in the silence. I felt the tension in my body start to ease, but a lingering unease stayed with me. It wasn't just the cow or the man or the laugh. It was the fact that I was in the middle of nowhere, with no one to help if things went south. I still don't know what I saw that night. Was the man just some lone rancher? Or had I stumbled upon something much darker, something better left forgotten? Whatever it was, I never took that back road again. And every time I drive at night, I wonder if I'll ever truly know what happened there. But some things, I think, are better left in the dark. I was driving home after visiting a friend who lived out in the countryside. It was late in the evening, and I had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way. The paved road had slowly turned into a gravel path, and soon, even the gravel disappeared. All that was left was a dirt track cutting through a dense forest. The further I drove, the darker it got. My headlights were the only source of light, and the trees on either side loomed over the road like silent, shadowy figures. I hadn't seen a single car or house for miles. My phone had no signal, and the gas tank was dangerously close to empty. I figured if I kept going, I'd eventually find a main road, or at least a sign to point me in the right direction. But after another 20 minutes of driving through the pitch-black woods, I started to doubt myself. That's when I saw it. Through the trees, a dim light flickered. It was faint, almost like a candle, but it was enough to catch my attention. I slowed the car down and peered through the darkness. The light was coming from what looked like an old cabin tucked deep into the woods. It was barely visible through the thick branches, but the glow of the light was unmistakable. I stopped the car and stared at the cabin. The idea of going up to a random house in the middle of nowhere felt stupid, but I was lost and running out of options. Maybe whoever lived there could give me directions, or at least tell me how to get back to the main road. It wasn't like I had many other choices. I turned off the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out of the car. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. The air was cold, and a faint mist clung to the ground, making everything feel even more unsettling. As I approached the cabin, I noticed how run down it looked. The wooden walls were weathered and warped, the roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were covered with grime. The light inside flickered like it was coming from a candle or an oil lamp. I couldn't see anyone through the windows, but I could feel the weight of being watched. It was the kind of feeling that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I hesitated at the front door. It was slightly ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges. There was no doorbell, so I knocked on the wood. The sound echoed through the quiet forest, louder than I had expected. I waited, but no one answered. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone home?" Still nothing. I pushed the door open a little further and shone my flashlight inside. The cabin was as decrepit on the inside as it was on the outside. The wooden floor was covered in dirt and leaves, and the walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper that was peeling in long strips. A small table sat in the center of the room, and on it was the source of the light, a single candle burning low. The room smelled damp, like mold and rotting wood. I stepped inside, my boots creaking against the floorboards. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years, but the candle suggested otherwise. Someone had to have lit it recently, right? I called out again, louder this time. "Hello. I'm just looking for directions." My voice echoed through the empty cabin, but there was no response. The silence was deafening. I thought about leaving, but my curiosity got the better of me. Something about the place didn't sit right with me, and I wanted to understand what was going on. I walked over to the table and looked around. There were no signs of food, no dishes, no personal belongings. Nothing that suggested someone actually lived here. The only thing on the table, besides the candle, was a small, old notebook. The notebook looked fragile, like it would crumble if I touched it. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I picked it up carefully and opened it. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, scrawled across the pages in uneven lines. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was reading. The words were disjointed, full of strange symbols and phrases that didn't make sense. But as I flipped through the pages, something caught my eye. It was a single sentence written over and over again, filling an entire page. "Do not go into the woods." I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. The message was clear, but it only added to the growing unease I felt. Why would someone write this? What was so dangerous about the woods? I closed the notebook and set it back on the table. I needed to leave. This place felt wrong, and the longer I stayed, the more anxious I became. I turned to head back to the door, but as I did, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, coming from somewhere outside the cabin, but they grew louder, closer, until it sounded like they were circling the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps weren't hurried. They were slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was taking its time. I turned off my flashlight and stood perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The only light in the room came from the flickering candle, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. But then, I heard something else, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails running across the wooden walls. The sound moved around the cabin, circling it slowly, methodically. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it an animal? A person? Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be subtle. They wanted me to know they were there. I backed away from the table, my eyes darting around the room for something to defend myself with. There was nothing, no tools, no weapons, nothing that could help me. The scratching stopped, and I heard the footsteps again, this time right outside the front door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't know what to do. Running seemed like the worst possible option, but staying here felt just as bad. I was trapped. Suddenly, the candle went out. The room was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the blackness. The door creaked open wider, and the footsteps moved inside. I didn't wait to see who or what was coming. I bolted for the back door, stumbling over the uneven floorboards as I ran. I threw the door open and sprinted into the forest, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The branches clawed at my face and arms as I pushed through the undergrowth, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps again, faster this time, chasing after me. They were heavy, deliberate, and getting closer with each passing second. I didn't dare look back. The fear was overwhelming, driving me forward even as my legs burned and my lungs screamed for air. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like an eternity, but eventually, the forest began to thin, and I saw the faint outline of my car up ahead. I pushed myself harder, my legs threatening to give out, and finally reached the car. I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't care about the potholes or the branches scraping against the sides of the car. I just needed to get out of there. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I finally let myself breathe. I pulled over, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My entire body was trembling, my heart still racing. I looked back in the direction I had come from. The road behind me was dark and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. I never went back to that area. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that whatever was out there wasn't natural. It wasn't something I was meant to understand. Some places are better left unexplored.